So I've just come out of Alex Garland's new film, and it's really sad to see how much it went out of its way to supposedly be politically neutral, yet just can't seem to help portraying the political backdrop through a leftist lens. Well, either that or it's incredibly detached and unself-aware, and genuinely seems to think that it's a centrist position on current day politics. Which in that case is absolutely fascinating to observe what these filmmakers think is remotely neutral. Look, first things first, this film is essentially about what happens if a certain naughty orange man wins re-election again this year, and presumably after the equally naughty Russians interfere and installed him back into office or some shit. The movie starts out with what is clearly a Donald Trump avatar, and even going so far as to mimic his speech patterns no less, announcing that, quote, Texas and Cali will be welcomed back to the states when their illegal secessionist government is deposed, and is later heard talking throughout the film about pledging his allegiance to the US flag, fulfilling the promise of their forefathers to the flag, nation and God, and basically saying he's just trying to MAGA. And I'm just like, yeah, okay then, sounds good. Like, what the frig am I even supposed to be mad about here? Why are they even against him for? I mean, there's background ancillary dialogue implying that he didn't leave at the end of his second term and may have even fired on his own citizens, but this is second-hand info and comes from someone who may or may not even be reliable. Because the movie uses characters to deliver subjective slithers of key background information. Like when they sit and talk about how the government reportedly now, quote, shoot journos on sight in DC as they see us as enemy combatants. Which of course in itself is a manifestation of fake news taken to its logical endpoint in the leftist worldview, and how conservatives see all form of legacy media as dangerous, and thus here needs to be physically removed, even though it's not even the right wing censoring news stories these days. But also when the older journo suggests asking the president why he disbanded the FBI, has taken a third term and employed airstrikes against American citizens. But that's really all the background context we get. And of course, I'm just left thinking, what on earth led up to all that? Like, was the federal justice systems totally out of control and operating on a rogue basis? Because if so, that seems like pretty fair justification to intervene and break them up. And also, what caused the president to then feel like he needed to hold on to power and not hand over the White House in the first place to these people? Like, did they attack his presidency first? Did they spend 4 years framing him as a Russian spy, undermining his efforts to enact democratically endorsed policy and then firebombing the White House without consequence? The movie doesn't provide any backstory or further context, so we're not enabled to make a fair assessment as to who is in the right or in the wrong, at least beyond the caricatured black and white good versus evil surface level take as is presented in the primary narrative. I mean, what if the firing on his own citizens was just false framing by hostile partisan press? Or simply a false flag by the rogue intel agencies trying to blame him for a civil war? Who knows? There's just not enough context in the movie itself to make an evaluation. The film is missing some key context in terms of how the country ended up this way and what conditions occurred to make the president, who says he is all about the Constitution, cling to power in this way. So because of that, it's very hard to feel like the final execution of a supposed fascist is cathartic or even earned. Especially when the film has not presented enough of an outline of who this guy even was outside of the basic good versus evil childlike framing of his eventual actions, and all of which we only hear about in the background scenes anyway. But it is interesting to get a glimpse of exactly what the supposedly neutral standpoint of the liberal Hollywood hegemony inside the industry bubble is these days. I mean, these people really do seem to think that if Donny T is re-elected, he'll immediately start bombing his own citizens and making plans to change laws in order to secure a third term and never leave office. And seriously, that Rachel Madcow woman even explicitly railed off such conspiracy theories unironically on a primetime news show last year.
And when they inevitably rule that presidents aren't immune from prosecution after they leave office, what that will tell Donald Trump, if by then he is president, is that he can never leave the office of the presidency.
Right.
And if he is voted out in 2028, he cannot leave office, and he is willing to he is welcome to commit any crimes he wants to, as long as he is still president, in order to ignore the result of that election and stay in power for life, because otherwise he is going to go to prison when he gets out.
I mean, I would assert that the current POTUS trying to financially ruin and outright jail his leading political opponent would be far more fertile ground to base a proposed civil war story on, but I guess that would be too close to the bone for these people. But anyway, the racial politics of this movie is so insulting it's truly beyond belief. All the goodies are racially diverse and stunning and brave feminists, or even seem to have obese representation on their team. whilst the heroic journos only encounter deranged rednecks who are played by whites who hate minorities because reasons. And suddenly, as if by magic, straight white guys can now get hired in Hollywood again. Literally all the baddies in this film are Caucasian males, who tend to be at best antisocial, and at worst, seem to possess zero likability, empathy or mercy. As we see with Jesse Plemons' group and the working class gas station bandits, these are portrayed as backwards conservative caricatures and intimidating goons who cannot be bought, bullied, bargained or reasoned with. So if you're a likeable Asian from Hong Kong, or just loves doing budget Fast and Furious stunts and genuinely living life to the full with your mates, then you're going to be yeeted quicker than a voice of reason on Reddit.
Shame.
It's just outright insulting the way the right wing and quite frankly white men are portrayed in this movie. There's zero balance, and also like this hostile seething undercurrent of contempt just for one side throughout the film, despite pretending to maintain an air of balanced neutrality on the surface. It honestly feels like the leftist worldview, like in their mind, if democracy fails and the thin veneer of civility falls, conservatives will feel free and emboldened to act out their hate-filled fantasies of, check notes, exterminating foreigners. Oh, okay. Okay, movie. Yeah, you're so unpartisan, guys. For Garland to assert this film is not biased either way is kind of amusing, when the entire film is about a multicultural team trying to survive against hateful and hostile straight white men with stereotypical conservative traits and working class speech patterns, and literally ends with a racially diverse group of men and women joyfully standing over the corpse of white supremacy as the lead journo says that'll do pig in a foreign accent.
Damn!
Well, he doesn't actually say pig, but his voice is glazed with so much contempt that he may as well have. And as an aside, I can't help but feel that this scene could also serve to symbolise the mainstream press getting back at Trump for calling them fake news for the best part of a decade and constantly undermining their credibility. Even though in the real world and to anyone paying attention, they only really have themselves to blame for losing the trust of the public. Anyway, Garland loves this iconic final tableau so much that he not only ends his film with it, but also lets the end credits play out over the freeze frame of his liberal heroes revelling in their victory. So we have to sit there for 3 minutes watching this image of them standing over the cadaver of the white man and or the Donald Trump avatar, just so we can indulge in the leftist wet dream of crushing Whitey. Because I think in reality what we're seeing here is a mask-off moment for their ilk, because this is really the end point of their culture war. For leftists, they want to utterly annihilate the right wing, and what they see is nothing more than a fascistic movement of irredeemable hate merchants. So in this way, the final shot represents this pretty well, with a group of minorities dominating the avatar of everything leftists hate. It symbolises the domination of their worldview, as the old world lies cold and bleeding at their feet, and the ultimate emblem of their utopia, as the multicultural democracy defeats and stands tall over the cowardly corpse of the old guard, and the fascist steel bones of the constitutional republic. Which, depending on where you fall politically, is either a summation of life goals, or else a crying shame and possibly even an outright threat. Ultimately, this film is made by a left-aligned individual who thinks they're neutral and laughably the centrist political position, which I think in itself exemplifies everything that's wrong with today's culture and the warped twisted status of the Overton Window. Because when we exist in a world where Elon Musk, a literal African-American who is anti-war and traditionally votes Dem, is now considered a fascist right-winger for, checks notes, not censoring legal speech, I don't know what else to say, really. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the beginning of the film, a white person carrying an American flag suicide bombs a bunch of innocent multiracial people trying to get water from an aid truck. Like, seriously, Alex? What kind of neutrality is this, when the message here seems to be that patriotism is a violent movement which just wants to cause mass harm to innocents for political agendas? Is this how the writers really see America or American history? You know, last time I checked, it wasn't patriotic Americans or Christians blowing themselves up for the glory of martyrdom. That's usually coming from another section of the religious demographic and that we ain't really allowed to talk about here on the YouTubes. But it all certainly sounds exactly like how the current mainstream news ecosystem and globalist cultural hegemony sees MAGA, for example. So if this is also how the director sees things, then how can this possibly be non-partisan? Especially when 70 million Americans voted for its leader in the very last election. And saying that, if you were truly coming from a neutral position, where's the depiction of left-wing violence and terrorists blowing up police stations and military bases whilst wrapped in communist flags? Wouldn't they be chomping at the bit to assist in taking down the fascists? Seriously, there's zero depiction of any kind of leftist groups and well-known organised cells like Antifa in this film, who, as we see IRL, are the real violent threats who go out burning cities down for 6 months without consequence. Why were they not in the streets here fighting the good fight? Well, apparently, there's only a single mention of them in the film when they talk of the quote, Antifa massacre. That's of course ambiguously worded so as not to know whether that means Antifa were massacred by the right wing or whether they were the ones doing the massacring. But given the overall political worldview of this movie and its creators as previously explored, I don't think it's much of a stretch to lean toward the former interpretation, which also explains their absence from the wider film. But ultimately, the point is that all this only seems to go one way as usual. And if this is what they really think is a neutral position, then it all just encapsulates how far leftward the Overton Window has been wrenched, and perhaps goes some way in explaining why our culture today is in such a polarised, divisive state. And if we're not careful, we may end up exactly where the movie ends up, either bleeding under the boot or gloating above it. And I'll leave it to you to decide which is worse.